everyone. I'll give you a moment to connect to sound. Hello. Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1108th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe, Director of Programs at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Dike Blair and Jonathan T.D. Neal. And now I'll introduce Dike and Jonathan. Dike Blair uses gouache, oil, his own photographs, and strategies appropriated from postminimalist sculpture to create intimate tableaux that transform quotidian sights and materials into exercises in formalism. A writer and teacher, as well as an artist, Blair came up in the downtown scene of 1970s New York among punk rockers and postmodernists. In the early 1980s, against prevailing art world trends toward Neo-Expressionism, he began rendering scenes from his life in gouache on paper. These ongoing diaristic paintings are devoid of human figures, but nonetheless evoke the specter of the artist whose daily life plays out at a remove across their finely wrought surfaces. Blair lives in New York and Sullivan County. And our host today, Jonathan T.D. Neal, was editor of the Held Essays on Visual Art for the Brooklyn Rail from 2011 to 2015, and we're lucky to have him as an editor-at-large for the Brooklyn Rail now. He is the co-founder of Inversion Art, a startup that provides investment strategy and management services to visual artists. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Jonathan to start us off.
Thank you, Chloe, and thank you, as always, for everybody at the Rail for the work you've been doing and for producing the new social environment series. It's always a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much to Dike for joining me in this conversation and being open to it. I want to begin, actually, Chloe, it might be worth just at the beginning here, sharing your screen, and maybe let's scroll through just a handful of the images to set the scene for the audience here. Thank you all for joining. I'm remiss not to thank the audience for taking their time to join us here on Zoom. But this way, for anybody who hasn't seen the show, currently up at Karma, of this new work of both oil and gouache paintings. It gives you a kind of idea about some of the new work that Dike has been working on. I guess one of the questions I wanted to ask you, Dike, sort of at the beginning, not specifically about this series, but about your relationship to photography and relationship to the image in general. And I want to guess let's start with something fairly mundane, which is when did you begin to make a shift into digital, and how would you characterize your relationship to the digital image, both sort of as an artifact as well as in a kind of temporal moment? And I guess to frame that for you, I was thinking about it for myself, and I was trying to think back to the sort of moment when I shifted, or my own sort of practices or relationships to imagery went from working with analog technologies or materials to working primarily with digital. And often we have a tendency to like date these things to when certain technologies became available, but forget that like very few of us ever begin working with those things, when they were first introduced to the marketplace or when they first went into wide distribution. And so I did a little personal digging and realized like the very first digital images that I have in my archive are from 2008, believe it or not, which is not exactly the birth of digital, but like that was, if I was going to take that as kind of the moment where I would begin working not with film or anything else, but was really sort of made the shift over to primarily working with digital images and on a screen. Which doesn't feel that long ago, to be totally honest. So I'm curious, from your standpoint, if there's a similar type of recency of your work with digital and what your relationship to it is.
Initially, early 80s, it was observational and from memory. And then I started using film, as a reference tool, as a sort of a drawing tool. And I continued with film into the late 90s, and then I then I switched to digital and saved an immense amount of money, and not developing things. It also kind of gave me and everybody knows this, gives you the freedom to, click away. Unlike film, that there's a price for every click. There's not so with digital. There. I personally noticed looking at the imagery, just the textural differences between film and digital, but I don't think that that's necessarily, since I'm taking it back into the analog, I don't think that distinction registers too much.
The distinction, sorry, between
Between film and
film and
digital.
digital.
Yeah.
But how, I guess though, if there was a distinction to be drawn, less about what maybe the outcome of that practice would be, and it sounds like more the way that you use the technology, like for example, saying that it's easier to click away, right? There isn't a cost to developing, and so now you can be a little bit freer with how you view what might be an image, or maybe you're not quite as curatorial or selective in what might make for an image that you would like to translate into paint or to gouache. Are there other things? Are there ways of using image making technologies that kind of shifted, or that you ever noticed was sort of a way of working with it that transformed from one?
Well, there's an ease. I mean, on the screen now is a nighttime picture of a pool, which with the iPhone is just instant. And when I used to do a similar image with film, I'd have to have the right film. I'd have to have a longer exposure. I'd have to have a tripod. It was more laborious. Now, that might feel like, oh, but then the image is better considered, but I'm not so sure that's true.
And have you found yourself, are those images more or less precious in a way?
I don't think so. I mean, when I go back through my archives of 4x6 Kodak envelopes, there are an awful lot of uninteresting things and a few interesting things, and the same sort applies with my digital archive.
Okay. I guess because it's there's a I don't want to, and I'm not going to push forever into the analog versus digital, but I guess I'm immensely curious with regard to your work on this kind of the status of the image and your kind of approach to, or your sensibility around the image as an entity that exists, or that is in some sense prior to the painted work, let's say, or the work of translation that often happens then in the gouaches and the oil painting, particularly of the last couple of years. I haven't had the chance to see this specific body of work in New York, but as we mentioned earlier this week, I was able to see the series of works that were displayed in Los Angeles, and I got into a interesting kind of quasi-heated argument about the kind of the status of the image and this and in our contemporary moment, and what your work kind of represents with regard to the status of the image. And my very tiresome conversation about that had to do with artificial intelligence and the fact that these things can now be generated, out of the archive, this kind of, the training data and this imagined archive of images that sort of exist in the ether. and you have now a technology that can kind of produce these images on tap that have no referent in the world. They aren't created out of the images of someone making them. And what that does to the kind of status of work like yours, where it has much to say about painting, it has much to say about a history of art, but it has, I think, equally as much to say about a history of image making and either the obsolescence of image making or the persistence of a type of image making today. And I was curious, do you think about the status of the image, or does it remain merely a kind of means to an end for your practice?
It tends to be a means to an end. And I need to sort of interject here that we're looking at, of course, at photographs of things that are sourced from photographs. So they're slightly deceptive, perhaps, about what the, and of course, being a painter, I want people to see the painting more than the photograph, but but I'm glad that we're looking at them. I've been asked a bunch about Instagram, various things, and what I think is being said is that the ubiquitousness of the photographic image has somehow made it less value, somehow devalued the image, and which isn't necessarily my opinion. I just think that's the question. And of course, I think I'm doing the inverse, which is investing or fetishizing, investing labor into the image, which is, again, I think the inverse of the function of the image on the AI image, the image on the screens.
Right. It occurred to me, thinking about this specific body of work, and maybe, Chloe, you can scroll to one of the images that has almost more of a kind of silhouette pattern, or it's a picture at dusk right there. I think number 20, right above that. Yeah. So there are a few images that do this or have this type of effect as well. And when I was looking at this, it made me think of no one so much as Magritte. And there's a kind of Rene Magritte character to this kind of liminal state of the brightened sky and the silhouetted evening shaded lower tier lower quadrants of the paintings. And I was just, out of sheer curiosity, if that is a intentional echo or a thought process that you've had in mind, working on specifically this kinds of series of works.
I mean, what happens? We're talking about the Empire of Light, I think, which one of my favorite painting. It didn't once cross my mind when I made this painting, which sort of applies to something that I discover in the studio. Like I really admire Neil Jeni's sky, I admire Ed Ruscha's skies, but I never walk into the studio and say, "Oh, I want to do something influenced by Ed Ruscha." And yet, on the other hand, sometimes it's 2 weeks later, 2 years later, I look at it and go, "Oh my God, that looks like one of my favorite Ruschas or something." So there's an unconscious assimilation of art history, and it shows up. But it's almost never conscious, with the exception, and there are no examples here, but I do paintings of paintings, and then that's very very self-conscious, picking the artist, picking the image, and but that would be the exception, I think.
Yeah. Do you think of yourself as making distinctly American pictures?
I do, yes.
And so, and then in your idea of it, what would make them distinctly American, or what is it that you sort of, not by sheer fact of you making them yourself, but what characterizes them as the sort of distinctly American for you?
Um, well, again, since they're diaristic almost entirely, and I'm American. I know you say that's not referring to that.
You don't get that answer. You
I
have to.
know. Um, uh, well, I think the subject matter often, whether it's a highway or a particular dashboard or a beverage on a table, the man-made things are one can generally locate in America. And I've done a bunch of, I've been a tourist in Europe, so I've done my Europe paintings, and you can usually tell which those are.
Interesting. Um, I'm also curious. It's not as evident in this series of works, especially these skies, but there seems to be a kind of equivalence between natural light and artificial light for you. Many pictures of fluorescent lighted interiors or headlights or scenes illuminated by headlights of cars or interiors of elevators, and even the nighttime pictures in this series of the pool. I'm curious, what is your, is it merely a kind of leveling aware of a sort of qualitative interest, equal interest in all types of light, or do you find yourself trying to capture things in artificial light in the paintings in a that is a contrast or comparison to the natural lighting or the sun lighting that you're or moonlighting that you're working with in many of these works?
Um, I think you're right. This body of work is an anomaly. It's somewhat, uh, you know, it's all the same subject, and it's all the same size, and it's all the same medium, and that's really been an exception in most everything I've done before. But I do somewhat consider myself a luminist, and if I call myself a luminist, then why the hell wouldn't I paint a fluorescent light bulb? And the challenge of the challenge of painting light, either uh, natural or industrial or whatever, is it's these kind of challenges that I find fun.
So it makes it a real kind of equivalence then between say natural light and some of the let's say the romanticization that one gets with the kind of luminist history of trying to capture this kind of ephemeral sense of light, and then that ephemerality is translated in a lot of the artificial lighted images, which is a very inelegant way of putting it. But is almost that sort of ephemerality is more kind of this sort of there's the temporality of the picture. It's kind of this like it's this. I'm trying to stay away from a lot of the language that's used often by other critics and commentators on the work, but I think the one that keeps coming to mind is the kind of interstitial, right? The interstitial space and the interstitial time, which has this kind of, it's almost like the anti-decisive moment in terms of the photographic language. If I think of the image of the pool at night with the pool vacuum that is there running, it kind of plays the same role as the clouds in the daytime scenes do in terms of this, fundamentally dynamic subject that is continually in motion, arbitrary to our standpoint, of what kind of configuration it might take. And so one kind of picture of it is going to be as good as any other kind of picture of it, because you don't get a kind of you don't get a choice in the matter, the way that you might with people or other types of figures. And so there's a kind of I feel like there's a kind of equivalence that's going on in the way that content is being treated. Do you see that similarly? Is that one of the things that you're trying to get to in the way that you work?
I'm not, if there's any drama or narrative, I want it to be happening more with the light than with, say, something in motion or I just discovered that robot, that vacuum robot, is now being replaced by a sort of vacuum that returns to its housing and recharges itself, and
it's the pool Roomba type of thing, where it's like this little box that
exactly.
Right.
So already these paintings that I just finished are dated.
Yeah, how technology comes for us all.
I think I didn't give you a great answer, but I'm not sure.
That's all right. I don't think it was a great question, or at least not a well articulated question. I mean, I think that maybe the reasons why it's somewhat inarticulate is I'm trying to get to, I think, a challenge for me when I'm looking at your work is this, this push and pull between what you've even mentioned and is sort of inevitably always mentioned in discussions of your work, and the kind is the diaristic, right? The idea that here is this kind of tracking of recording of things that revolve, that are part of your world, that gets selected, that then get painted. And part of the challenge is understanding how the diaristic accords with what you were trying to do, or your sense of yourself as an artist. And I was doing some of the reading around what others have written, and I was curious. I went down this rabbit hole of reading the Brian O'Doherty texts about Edward Hopper, and and this response that Hopper gives to Brian O'Doherty at the end of one of their sessions about, like, what are you painting? And after some long pause, Hopper says, "Me," right? Like, I'm painting me. And I'm curious, I don't know, like, it would seem pat for you to turn around and say, like, well, this is just one long project of self-portraiture, or I'm painting me. But I'm curious whether you see that as part of the project that you're working on.
Well, it's part of the project, but it's also part of the fiction. Who is the guy that doing these paintings, and in my editing of the work, which is not unlike, say, a magazine layout or something, I'm juxtaposing a limited number of things that are part of my world, and then it always involves attraction, and it almost always involves pleasure. But it also, the in the process of editing groupings, I'm creating a fiction also. I mean, I try to be honest, and I think this body of work is. I think I do that less in this body of work. This is, so what it is. I think a friend asked a writer, or suggested a writer write about this work, and the writer just said, what could I possibly say? Skies and pools. I think I do think there's maybe, oh, it could certainly be nameable, but there are emotional qualities to these things. And, but again, that gets into self-portraiture.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned this about like someone saying, what could I possibly write about it? Because it would just be naming. And not to bring it back to one of the sort of brief earlier discussion, but I remember on Tuesday when we had our brief check-in, and I said that I'd been thinking about Fred Jameson, the great Marxist literary critic who just passed away, and I had just gotten the new book was series of his the collection of his book reviews in the London Review of Books and other places from over the years. And he has actually like a really funny, which is bizarre for Jameson, but like a fairly funny review of Karl Ove Knausgaard's My Struggle, like the final issue of Knausgaard's epic book, where he talks about it as like the literature of the grocery store, or the literature of the supermarket, where it's literally just naming and he calls it the sort of art of itemization.
Yeah.
And I think I don't think Jameson was being necessarily kind of dismissive, but he also mentions this kind of like how there's this kind of Knausgaard, this sort of like endless sort of like reproduction of the self, right? This like nonstop sort of consideration of the self. And Jameson also mentions this one of this other author, German author, that's a hero of Knausgaard's, Gombrowicz, who has a series of diary entries that read Monday, me, Tuesday, me, Wednesday, me. And that's not what you're doing, right? This is not an art of itemization. It's not an art of, it is like, Dike, it seems like this is an art of like, not me. This is not me, right? Like, and so I'm curious what your, even though it is diaristic in one of the most sort of self-effacing, anonymizing ways imaginable. And where does that desire or what is driving that kind of anonymization for you?
Well, I don't like myself all that much, but and I'm not a particular fan of people like Jeff Dyer or that sort of hyper subjectivity doesn't particularly interest me. Now, my tastes in art is pretty varied, and so I'm not dismissing anything. I am going. I don't know if I have any choice but to make work that reflects me. And I've got a lot of false modesty, but it's still modesty.
I want to connect it up to a statement that you made in a previous conversation, I think with Catherine Taft out in LA, where you said that you like at one point you were sort of motivated by the possibility of trying to paint nothing.
A bit, and I think that was in reference to skies and
Right.
And my attraction to painting windows. And I tried a number of times to do pure sky, and I think Richter comes up because he could pull that off. I could never pull that off, and I always needed a window frame or some kind of architecture. With this work is, I think, as close as I've come to getting fairly, being almost entirely about light and atmosphere. But, that having been said, then something like a tree silhouette comes in and it starts to scream.
Yeah, it was, or or the edge of a cloud, right? Or a streamer behind. I think there's one that has like maybe jet streams from two planes that have driven overhead. Um, the other statement of the sort of the desire to paint nothing, it reminded me not nothing so much when I was looking at some of the gouaches of skies. Believe it or not, was like Morris Lewis, and
The
the
veil.
yeah, but the statement of like wanting to apply paint to the air, without the canvas, and kind of like like that moment of kind of minimalist or color field purity of getting the paint like Stella as good as it was in the can, or just getting the pure paint all by itself. And there are a couple of gouaches here that seem to almost get to that fiction, in a very deft way.
Makes me think of Michelle Grabner did some paintings on snow, spray on snow that I admired. Um,
Um, do you think so? Going back to that Hopper um, uh, overlap, and I should say that you also have this exhibition of paintings that are in dialogue with Hopper up at the Hopper House Museum. I can't remember the actual name of the
yeah, Opera House Museum.
Hopper House Museum. Um, that essay by O'Doherty talks a lot about Hopper's idea of personality. Um, do you think that your work exhibits a personality in that respect?
I'm not, well, that might not be for me to say. Um, uh, the Hopper comparison, and Robert Hobbs was the first art historian. Robert Hobbs was the first person who even brought this up to me. He said, "Oh, your work reminds me, or I associate it with Hopper's," and then he suggested a show, and then the show at Karma with Hopper led to this show at Edward Hopper House Museum. But this is all, it's a little bit like it wasn't my
Sure.
idea, sort of thing. Yeah.
Sure. Um, it was curious because I think that, I guess, maybe the other way of asking that is, do you think of your work or you as having a style, or do you see yourself working against or trying to sort of combat a kind of style of your own work?
I think of it more as, a lot of times when I think of style, I think of gestural work, and I do try to minimize gesture. Um, so there is an anti-stylistic character to that, I suppose. Um,
But you could take that, you have the choice of taking that to a more extreme, right? I mean, you could choose more technical devices. For example, looking at some of the work, you could imagine using airbrush, or you could imagine adopting other techniques, which would be even more kind of anti-gestural. So
oh yeah, okay. No, that's totally right. Um,
so I guess
So,
the I
so
guess
yeah,
the
it's a,
question.
it's a bunch of choices, and gouache and a particular kind of spray that I use that is a lot coarser than airbrush, the texture of the paper, all of these things that are, uh, millimeters deep, but are, that are perversely important to, in my little room where I paint.
Interesting.
Uh,
Yeah. Um, so I know that we're going to do a little bit briefer session than we normally would today. So I want to make sure that the audience, to the extent that you have questions for Dike about this work or any of the other work, please have them ready to go, because we'll open up the floor very shortly. I guess the final sort of question that I would have is, have you ever painted an image or painted work that you have found to be too personal to then want to show? Is there anything that's...
Well, there's, for the Hopper show, I did and it was one of the few posed paintings that I've done. Well, my wife sitting on the beach in Gloucester with sketching, and after the painting that Hopper did of Joe on the beach, very same beach, very same house in the background, and she won't let me show it. So
I say, not too personal for you, but too personal for your wife.
Exactly.
So there's never been anything that's come up that's been too close to you that it can't be revealed, or maybe those are just the photographs that don't make it into the painting series.
I mean, I could, I wouldn't do a painting of my genitals or something, or I wouldn't, they're just things that I wouldn't do because they'd be impolite or they'd be stupid, or and again, and that goes back to the little bit of the fiction that I create of, who's the guy who makes these, and so maybe that lack of reveal or something might be part of that.
Yeah, interesting. I think of it as just sort of curious if this is like, if this all revolves around a kind of some undisclosed thing, which is Dike Blair in quotation marks, or the subject of the paintings, which is never the subject that is painted in the work, constantly revolving around some center which remains out of sight and ultimately inscrutable.
Even one of the subjects, I mean, it becomes, it's self-reflexive, where I've done, I did this painting. I was looking at one painting in 1987 with a pink lightning, and which is after Martin Johnson Head's Approaching Storm with pink lightning. And then I sort of inserted some pink lightning in one of these paintings. And that's just me playing with myself. And I think that's a big part of, or so that's certainly some part of what happens, when I'm contemplating a picture to take or a picture to paint.
Interesting. All right, I think with that, we should open up the conversation to the audience. See if there are any questions or things that people have to say about the work that's on display at Karma or at the Hopper House Museum, or any other aspects of Dike's work.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Dike, for this lovely conversation. I encourage all of you to post your questions to the form in the chat, and we'll turn to you shortly. I'm going to ask the first question. Dike, I'm curious about the scale of the paintings at Karma and how you came upon that specific scale for the works.
The skies are all exactly the same scale, and I fiddled around with making them bigger and making them smaller, and that felt right. The pools, on the other hand, scaling those was more particular. And part of my process is I print out the image to scale or to different scales, and I hang them in my studio, and I make them bigger, make them smaller. And also I let them hang around for a few weeks before I consider doing them, because sometimes they, I realize they're not going to work.
Thank you for that. I'm going to ask one more question before I hand it over to the questions from the audience. I really liked the part of your conversation with Jonathan where you were talking about the window frame and like the way that you felt you had to put the frame in with the sky. And when looking at these paintings, I kept finding always this anchor to the ground, whether it be the tree hovering in the corner or the top of a building or the pool reflecting the sky from the ground. And I'm wondering if you're thinking about that consciously when making the works, about anchoring and about you being on earth and looking up and that being a part of the vision of the painting, or if that's subconscious and just something that slips in time and time again with these reflections about the sky.
I mean, that's a formal decision, and I make formal decisions without necessarily naming them. I did one thing that was fairly constant in any landscape or most anything I did was that if there was nature, there always had to be culture, and that was what was happening with the sky and window frame, and again, a lot of these are really the exception because they're at least more than half of them are 100% nature.
That makes sense to me. Thank you for answering my questions. Frank is wondering if, in the audience, is wondering if solipsism plays any has any importance to your vision.
Once again, well, maybe not no, not technically. I'm not a solipsist, but maybe metaphorically. And one of the things about these skies, I think, is that with the pandemic, I had some back issues, and I turned 72. Stuff like that. My world has gotten really small, where it all happens within 100 yards of where I'm sitting here talking to you. Whereas, before it was a little more expansive. So that's something else that's going on in this body of work. And I spend a lot of time alone, so there is probably something solipsistic about it.
Thanks for that question, Frank. I think the last questions today is going to be from Fong. Fong, I'll give you the chance to unmute to ask.
Thank you, Chloe. Congratulations, Dike.
Thanks, Fong.
Yeah, can't wait to see the show. So I've been traveling a bit. Thanks for the thoughtful question also, Jonathan. And yeah, I heard that you were talking about Brian O'Doherty, one of the friend and mentor to me in the Rail for sure. And you were mentioning about Hopper, and make me think of his terrific volume, American Master, The Void and the Myth. I think that's the one that include everybody. I think it began with Hopper, and then Stuart Davis, Pollock, de Kooning, Rothko, Rauschenberg, Cornell, and then he ended with, I believe, Wyeth, that made everybody annoyed and even offended. A lot of people, friend of Brian at the time, Mel Bachner, Solowit, the predominant minimalists, hated that reference, and he had to defend himself. And he say, essentially, you don't live the country. We don't live in the country. We don't understand the violence of nature. And he mentioned that the fact that Rothko make remarks saying that Wyeth is about pursuit of strangeness, but he's not as whole as Hopper is whole. It's so interesting and make me think so much, because Sam Hunter, I don't know, you studied with him, Jonathan, by the time you went to Columbia,
No.
he already retired.
Yep.
He mostly associated with Hunter. He was there with Leo Steinberg and Rosenkranz. But he said something very smart. He said, Hopper does realist Rothko. Isn't that cool, Dike?
Could you repeat that, Fong?
Hopper does realist Rothko.
Huh.
Yeah, and that make me think a lot, you know. So my question is that in regarding to your deployment of photography, and Jonathan referenced it to diary or diaristic, and you've been around the East Village forever. You definitely have relationship with all of those people. And I wonder, two questions here. Number one, were you aware, you must have been aware of Jonas Maker's diaristic cinema. And it's not about self-effacing. I mean, I don't think maybe that's part of it, but it's really the other part is the poetic embrace of life in general. Can be random, can be incredibly epiphany of the highest order, could be very profound thing, very eventful thing. And sometimes it can be very uneventful, super boring things. So I wonder if there is a reference, there is a relationship with Jonas' diaristic cinema. It's very democratic, in the Whitman-esque sense. That's my first question.
Once again, not something I bring into the studio. If I try to put myself outside of myself, there are any number of filmmakers and people that I admire and can see certain analogous things going on. But I'll be a little insistent about the kind of what I bring into the studio to start making, and it's usually pretty banal.
Okay, that's good. I like the idea of being banal. So when banal meaning can be Warhol's sense of banality, or is it because as you know?
No, I'm not. That's super sophisticated banality.
Okay. No, but still, you painted this image. I remember, I think I mentioned it once. I'm not so sure whether Jonathan specifically, but John Updike wrote a review of Warhol 1993 MoMA retrospective. And it's had even a compelling title that I never forget. It's called Fast Art for Busy Manhattanite. And he basically dismissed Warhol production, arguing that seal screen are not painting. And yet I asked him, all right, that's fair, but did you ever spend time watching his film, sir? He said, no. Well, I say, well, they are super the opposite, super long, 6-7 hours long. And I was talking about, I think Warhol without the film would not be taken seriously because one is fast and one is super slow. So I wonder, Chloe asked a question about scale. I'm asking that question of how you mediate between speed and slowness, and in regarding to a certain need to crop composition. That's fair question to ask, don't you think, Jonathan?
Sure.
Okay, cool. Sure, he said.
I had an answer to the first part, and then the second part sent me out. And the first part of the question was, I was thinking about Frederick Jameson and Warhol and the Van Gogh and the shoes, and I was kind of falling with Van Gogh's shoes. And there was even a piece in the Times yesterday, I think, talking about the 150th anniversary of Impressionism, and sort of insisting how you needed to contextualize it. And I'm looking at the article and I'm seeing the Impressionists, but there's Alma Tadema and there other, and Jerome, and I love these guys, and so maybe somehow Jonathan could link that up with the Jameson. I forget the name of that piece, but it's diamond dust shoes and Van Gogh shoes.
The great opening to the book on postmodernism. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Fong, I completely avoided that question.
Definitely, very definitely.
Yeah, okay. No, but still compensation, cropping, which we know.
Oh, speed. That was what you meant. Yeah, speed is very much, I think, part of what these are about, because they're fairly clearly quick images of a moment that I think I mentioned earlier that I fetishize. I put labor in, which is completely designed to make you slow down and give it a much longer look than you would if these were photographs.
Should I ask one more? Is it okay if I ask one more question?
Fine with me.
Transcendentalism. It's so important in the development of American painting period. I have been admirers of Bryno Doherty, wife, partner, the great Americanist Barbara Novak, who spent her entire life studying American paintings. So transcendentalists, you mentioned heat. Of course, we have to think the context of intimacy against immensity. Those people who paint super small painting, like you mentioned heat, but then there's people who does the opposite, like Thomas Cole
or his friend Church. Yeah,
exactly. So again, it go back to intimacy, speed and slowness, but then it's also relate deeply to a sense of scale, whether it's small, intimate, or immensely monumental.
I'm small heat versus Church and somewhat romantic Van Gogh shoes versus Warhol shoes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you bring that up, because as you were talking, I was thinking about it as the scale. It's the scale is larger than the photographs. Obviously, photography itself is a type of is a type of kind of microscope, right? It's something that takes things. I think, Dike, you see this more in your images of drinks or cigarettes, right? It's a blow up. It's a way of creating a zoom effect or making something larger than it would normally appear. But when I think about it from the standpoint of speed or the timing of the works, I am, there's one way of thinking about this, and I think, Dike, you've said this before. It's like there's a kind of slowing down of the image, right? There's the practice of the painting is a way of kind of, tarrying with the color, the moment. But then I want to put that in direct relationship to the image itself, and I keep revolving around the temporality of the photograph or of image taking and image making, and the speed with which that takes place. And so I'm more thinking about that relationally as like a breaking effect, right? And it's like, not to put too vulgar of a point on it, but it's like each work is a kind of screeching of the tires and the kind of tunnel vision that one experiences in a quasi sort of traumatic moment where things get focused very quickly, very fast. And none of the works that you are painting themselves are evocative of that kind of traumatic moment, but the temporality of what's happening is in some sense similar, where it's not like a meditative slowing down for me, but it's a kind of pulling on the emergency brake of life in order not to be cast forward into the abyss of a kind of image world, or just the solipsism of painting merely whatever one wishes to of pure invention, right? Of the kind of abyss of the blank canvas, which is the kind of the field of open choices, right? Which can be very anxiety producing. And so it is at once that kind of relationship between the fast and the slow, not just a slowing down, but a kind of a braking effect, which has a more or less kind of speed to it. That's a little esoteric, a little bit far out there, but I wanted to get away from the mere idea that this is just kind of a way of sort of slowing down the speed of the world in order to, spend some time with it, which I think is a little bit more of a cliched way of thinking about how people relate to photography and relate to the image world today.
Yeah, it's a made image. It's not a technical image, but there's a relationship for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, you guys.
Thank you.
Can't wait to see the show, Dike. So
Thanks, Long.
and back to you.
Thanks
Chloe,
so much.
I have a very brief reading in order to
Oh,
close.
yeah, great.
I love that. Please do, Jonathan.
Okay.
Great.
I don't do poetry, and this was Dike. I've been like casting around trying to figure these things out with relationship to your work. The last time that I wrote about your work, I had mentioned Wittgenstein and Wittgenstein on photography, and so I was doing some reading last night, and always Wittgenstein's the closest that I get to kind of philosophical poetics, or at least the kind of esoteric. So I've got a very brief passage from Philosophical Investigations that I hope you'll humor me with. This takes place at towards the beginning of the second section, and we'll see. Maybe it's productive, maybe it's not. But I'll begin. Again, this is Wittgenstein from Philosophical Investigations. What makes my image of him into an image of him? Not its looking like him. The same question applies to the expression, I see him now vividly before me, as to an image. What makes this utterance into an utterance about him? Nothing in it, or simultaneously with it, behind it. If you want to know whom he meant, ask him. Suppose, however, that someone were to draw while he had an image, or instead of having it, though it were only with his finger in the air. He could be asked, whom does this represent? And his answer would be decisive. It is quite as if he had given a verbal description, and such a description can also simply take the place of the image.
Whoa.
Wow. Thank you so much for
Happy Friday.
Thanks, Jonathan.
That's the best review ever. Wittgenstein wrote it for you. Wow.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you, Dike. Thank you, everyone, for your
Thanks,
questions.
Chloe. Thanks, Rail. Thank everyone.
All right. Have a good Friday. Thanks, Fong. Thanks, Chloe. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. I'm going to throw open the mic so everyone can say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Dike.
Thank you, Dike and Jonathan.
Congratulations again, Dike.
Bye.
Jonathan.
Take care, everybody.
Go see the show, guys. Don't forget.
Go.
Please. And happy weekend.